Hey, what's up? In this video, I want to show you something I learned recently to make your React components way more reusable. This integrates really well with TypeScript. However, you can follow along in JavaScript just fine. So let me show you what I learned, how it can make your React components way more reusable, and let's dive right in. Okay, hey, so we are in a Next.js 13 project. This is featuring the brand new app directory. Not that it really matters. This is kind of framework agnostic as long as you're somewhere in the React environment, right? Okay, so the point is we have one custom component which comes from add components and then the new doc button, which is this button right here. And essentially what we want to do is turn this button into a reusable component that we can also style and customize from wherever we render it, because that's the premise of a reusable component, right? That's the whole goal. Now, previously, if you're not too familiar with TypeScript, you might do something along the lines of, having a class name in here and then defining that class name in your props that you receive for that component as something like a string, for example. Now that works, we can do that, and now we can pass the class name like this to the button saying class name, and now whatever we pass from the page as the class name, something like background of red 500, would be rendered on the front end and shown on the button. However, this gets really confusing and hard to maintain as soon as you get multiple properties. So let's say from the page.tsx we also want to control whether the button is disabled. So we say disabled, and that would by default be true because we passed the property. Then we would also need that in here. Disabled is an optional boolean. And then we can say disabled is equal to disabled, that we also need to receive here from the props. Now that would work as well, right? Same principle, it would be disabled right now. If we check the browser, you can see the icon is a bit different. We didn't specify any disabled styles, but the mouse is different, so this button is currently disabled. This is not the best approach to do it. In fact, it's, I think, the worst one you can take. It might seem intuitive at first, but this is hard to maintain. It's not really reusable in the sense that we want. We have to define every attribute that we want to pass to the button as a prop, typing it out ourselves, and that is not the point of having reusable components. So the question then becomes, how do we make this better? And let's get to the solution part. So that was the problem. Now let's get to the solution. What we can do is, first off, let's remove all of this. And now in the button component, we can do something really cool. Because we're working with TypeScript, we can say interface new doc button props that we pass right here to the functional component. You could type this out differently. You could also have this as the new doc button props and leave away the whole FC thing. That would also work. Now these don't contain anything yet, that's why this is highlighted. I just chose to go the FC route, but it does not really matter, just because somebody asked me in the past which approach is better, and there is no real better approach. Okay, now how do we get the class name? How do we get the disabled and so on? Let's delete that first. Let's remove these values. So the better approach we can take is extending this interface. So we can say extends, and then we can say react.html attributes, and in here we can pass something, and in our case that's going to be the button, right? So we're going to say html button element, and as you can see, that works. So essentially, if you're not too familiar with TypeScript, what we're doing here is saying we want our interface to also include every value that an HTML button element has by default. So that is very interesting, because now we can say in the page.tsx, if we press Control and spacebar, we can see for the autocomplete, before it was just the custom properties that we had, but now it's very different. Now we can pass all the properties that the React button gets by default, right? I mean, most of these we don't need to worry about, but essentially what that allows us to do is to kind of tweak this component wherever we render it. So if one instance we render it is in the page.tsx and we want a specific attribute like area label, label of, page.tsx, for example, and then in another place we want the area label to be, wherever we render that. Not that it would make any sense, but we can define all the attributes that the button normally gets. Now, one kind of weird thing I've noticed is that some properties are missing. For example, the disabled, right? We could pass the area disabled, but that's not what we want. maybe that is what we want, but in our case, that's the disabled we want to pass. That doesn't fly right now. That doesn't work. And what we can do is in this object right here, define all the custom properties that we still want in the button, right? So this extends kind of ends here. And in here is everything that we want to pass ourselves. So only custom properties go here. So everything that we want custom goes in here, but by default we have all the elements inside the button. So if you wanted a disabled prop, that would be an optional boolean, and we can say the button is disabled if this is disabled. So we also want to receive that as the props right here. And instead of having the really ugly disabled is equal to, you know, in object notation disabled, we can literally just pass disabled, and that will work just fine. And now we can get all the props that we pass from the page.tsx. So let's say we wanted to pass the area label of button, right? We want to pass that. Right now, this is not being displayed in our component. And the way we receive everything that we pass is through the last argument being the props that we spread in. And then here we can now say props passed to button like that. And let's log out the props in the console and see what happens. So whenever we render this component, let's reload the page. We can go back into our console, and in here we can see what we've just logged out, and I can make that a bit larger, is the area label of button. Now, if we were to pass anything else, something like, you know, area busy is gonna be equal to true, for example. I'm just passing random values here, just to see that they also get logged out in the button. And the way we can then transfer them to our button is by spreading them in. So we can say all the props that we receive from the page.tsx or wherever we render this component instance will then be spread into the button and thereby used in the button. So what that allows us to do is also use something really cool like the class name. So we can say background red of 500 specifically right here, because in this instance we only want the background red if we render it on the page.tsx, because otherwise if you always wanted that, you would specify that in the button right here. But let's say in this instance we want the background red of 500, then we can go back in the browser and see, okay, cool, that works just fine. Now, there is a better approach to the class name specifically. So for example, let's say we pass the class name. Instead of having it as the props spread in, we can also destructure it directly, and that means it's not contained in the props anymore, but instead it's the separate property, the class name that we've received right here. And the reason we get no TypeScript error is because the class name is in this one right here that we are essentially extending the interface by, meaning we have access to it with TypeScript, and it also knows what the class name is as a string or undefined, you know, because of this syntax right here, because we extended the element. And now what we can do is kind of a best practice in my opinion. So let's say we want to pass the custom class name to the button. What we can do is dynamically combine this. So as you can see up here, I've defined a utility function to merge Tailwind classes. This uses two separate packages. One is CLSX, and the other one is Tailwind merge from Tailwind merge, both available in NPM. And essentially what we can do with them is conditionally render Tailwind classes. So we invoke that function, and then by default we maybe want to pass background red of 500, but let's say we also want to pass, you know, the cursor not allowed if the button is, you know, is loading, for example. Now this is loading property is just an example. It doesn't exist, so let me mock that. Is loading is equal to false. But you know, this would be dependent on your API call, if this button makes any API call. And then as the final argument, so after that, we want to pass the original class name. So that means our button will have default styles that we pass in as the first argument, then conditional styles that we apply depending on some properties like API calls, but also then as the last argument, the class name we pass from wherever we render it. So let's say we wanted a text of large. I think that's, yeah, it's text. Okay, so we can save that, and then the text will be large, the background will be red, but we only pass the text large from right here because we append it to the conditional class name, and it's kind of out of screen. That looks a bit weird. I should probably adjust my prettier, but I think you get the gist of it. Essentially, we are doing the conditional rendering that we're just mocking with a constant and then appending the original class name to allow for default styles of the button and then custom styles depending on wherever we render it. Now, obviously, be careful what you pass as the class name, because this should be a reusable component that looks similar in all occurrences. But this is a best practice I want to show you, just extending the element and then handling custom classes like this. I think it will make your code way more maintainable, way easier to read, and just an overall better practice to implement in your React projects. Okay, that was all I want to show you. Thank you very much for watching and congratulations on your cool new reusable components. I'll see you in the next one and bye bye.